All right, what a morning, right? It's kind of a picaresque projector situation, which is perfect given that today we'll be talking about Murillo's paintings of children and genre scenes. So we'll wait for the lights, but now everyone can hear me. I don't want to begin before you can really see. Okay. So last week, as you might have gathered, we moved extremely quickly, and we went through Murillo's entire career, from his start as a young artist all the way to his death in 1682, all in 1 hour. So luckily today, we are going to be focusing a lot more narrowly, and it will move a lot more slowly, which will give us time to savor individual works of art, which I think is what we're all here for anyway, right? But what we did see last week was that Murillo, by mid-century, was the most in-demand religious painter in Seville. He won all of the major commissions, and here I've illustrated his series of lunettes for the Church of Santa Maria la Blanca, which was patronized by Justino de Neve, and we talked about that last week. And here we can see what Murillo at his best, right? He was a master of gracefully engaging compositions. We see the same appeal here at his in his series for La Caridad. And he's a master also of emotionally appealing to the viewer, which is something that we will see more and more in his paintings of children. He never left Seville in his lifetime, with the exception of a trip to Madrid in 1658 when he was 40 years old. Even though he was already a well-established artist in Seville, this trip really did influence his style. And after his exposure to Velázquez and the Spanish Royal Collection, which was so rich with Italian painting, he perfected his style. And his signature fluid brushwork, hazy sfumato-esque execution, and luminous approach to color, we can particularly appreciate that here in this Madonna from Dulwich. His reign over Sevillian painting was solidified by the 1660s, particularly in the already mentioned series for La Caridad, and we saw that Murillo was actually a brother of this confraternity, and we saw that this confraternity's charitable activities came right at a time when Seville was most in need of such activities, right? We remember that in 1649, a plague decimated the population, and of course there were many dead to bury, which was the original founding mission of this brotherhood, but also other types of charity that they engaged in, such as handing out bread, particularly needed during the years of famine. And as a brother, Murillo would have been expected to have a very physical, intimate relationship with the city's poor. The brothers, if they encountered someone in need of charity on the street, they were supposed to carry them back to the brotherhood on their backs, and once there, they were supposed to wash their feet and kiss them. So we might imagine that as a brother of La Caridad, Murillo would have had a very close relationship with the city's poor. And we'll explore that a little bit more towards the second half of this lecture. But before we get there, let's start with his painting of children, and in particular his painting of holy children. And here I have a slide of Seville to remind you of the city in decline. And please forgive me as I looked, I can't see what's on the screen, so I do have to look back, and I'm sensing that my voice is a little interrupted when I do that. So if I make a point and you can't hear it, just holler out at me. So Murillo's most famous paintings in the 19th century were perhaps his paintings of children. His images of children were painted in the context of a society that increasingly viewed childhood as an age of innocence. And we can see that here. Oh boy, I don't know how I'm going to read this quote without microphone access. So can you hear me if I just project? Okay. So children are the flowers of humanity, its most pure and delicate blooms. Who is not moved by the sight of a child? Look at it attentively. Do the purity of its eyes, the sweetness of its voice, and the charming countenance say nothing to you? Is there anything more beautiful in nature than that serene brow and those cheeks blushing with modesty? That pretty little head, that blonde hair, those lovely big eyes, are those the eyes of a criminal? And remember that that lovely appearance is no more than a weak reflection of the beauty of its soul, like a brilliantly smooth mirror which shows fully its noble heart, pure, upright, and generous. And this is a 17th century Jesuit author writing this. And we see this over and over in sermons from the period, idealizing childhood. And it's important to note that we can think about all of this in the context of 20th century scholarship about the invention of childhood. Particularly, there's a French scholar who wrote in the 60s about the invention of childhood, and his argument is that in the Middle Ages and before, the concept of this pure and innocent childhood didn't exist. You can take that as you will. But the devotional context in the 17th century is looking towards childhood as an age of innocence and perfection, particularly for the soul. And we see that most clearly in paintings of holy children throughout 17th century Spanish art. Upstairs we have this painting by Cano, and Christ child here is exalted as a model of perfection. Murillo's particular approach to holy children is even more affectionate and tender, and it is precisely these types of images that won him so much fame and regard in the 19th century, and then in the 20th and even into the 21st century caused him to lose his appeal. And you can see why. It's such a beautiful image, but it is quite sweet. It's almost something that you would expect to find cross-stitched on a pillow or on a mug, and for good reason. I think it does that quite nicely. But because of that sweetness, again, critics might be tempted to dismiss Murillo, but he is a very serious and very accomplished painter. As we can see in these details, the work is, of course, tender and sweet, but also he's a master here of his sketchy brushwork. There are passages of bold application. We can see the paint very confidently applied here in the textiles. And here we can also see the same sort of technique and approach to childhood at work in his painting of the Good Shepherd. He's just a master of portraying children, and we might be tempted to read into his biography. If you'll remember, he was one of 14 children, and he himself had 9 children. So he would have been very much in a world dominated by toddlers, probably at every given moment of his life. And as any of you who've ever been around toddlers, you know that leaves a lasting impression. And I want you to pay particular attention to the feet as we go along. Murillo is a master of painting children's feet. You may not have realized that, but by the end of this lecture, you certainly will. And I want you to pay attention to these holy children's feet and how perfect they are, and we are going to see quite a stark contrast once we get to the genre scenes with the poor children. In this period, we also see scenes of the Holy Family modeling domestic bliss, the perfect family here with nothing but tenderness and love. And like I said, Murillo knows his way around small children, and we can see that in the charming details he chooses to include that bring these scenes of the Holy Family down to earth. They become relatable and approachable, and all the better as models for the ideal family. And we can even see the little Christ child playing with this small bird gently, but he still is playing. And then, of course, the charming little dog, and Mary, of course, as the ideal housewife there with her spinning and her sewing basket. Again, scenes like this is the Education of the Virgin, where we see Saint Anne teaching the Virgin to read, approached with very similar tenderness. And this was a favorite subject of civilian painting in the 17th century. And again, we see Murillo as a master of that hazy, vaporous brushwork, particularly in the hair. His approach to profane children as opposed to sacred ones is similarly affectionate, but also it's quite distinct. And the perfect painting, I think, to bridge the gap between the discussion of Murillo's holy children and his genre scenes is this painting here that you see on the screen. And it depicts Tomás de Villanueva as a young boy, and it depicts a legend from the life of this Augustinian saint. As a little boy, supposedly he was already so holy and charitable that he took the clothes off his back. You can see him undoing his breeches here, and he's distributing them to the poor street urchins that might as well have been plucked off the streets of 17th century Seville. And there's more than local color on display here. Murillo is taking the opportunity to address that theme that runs through almost all of his series, which is that charity is the key to salvation, and that charity involves direct and physical contact with the poor. His scenes of street life do share elements in common with his painting of holy children, and I think this is a great example. If you look, the pose of this young urchin eating grapes is quite similar to the pose of the young John the Baptist. And you can particularly see this in the position of the feet. And here you have the clean feet of the saint contrasted with the very dirty feet of the street boy. And it's interesting to think about shoelessness on the street means one thing versus on a saint means another. On the saint, you might think of it more in terms of an idealized perfection, and on an urchin boy, you might think of them more as a sign of his pitiable situation. If Murillo's holy children are models for an idealized childhood and the perfection of the Christian soul, then his more earthly children, particularly in group compositions, are intended to engage with the viewer and coach our responses. This is what I meant last week when we talked about the festaiuolo, which again is a very difficult word to get out of the mouth with that many vowels, but I've put it here by popular demand so that you can take note of the festaiuolo. And this is a trope that comes from Italian theater. On the stage, it would be a figure that would come on the stage and coach your response to what's going on in the play, right? So if you're supposed to laugh, the festaiuolo would come out and show you that you're supposed to laugh. And he breaks the fourth wall and engages directly with the audience. And this literally means feast maker, so it's almost like an MC, a master of ceremonies. And typically in the group compositions, the festaiuolo is the only one that's engaging directly with the viewer. And we can see this in a painting with which I'm sure you're all familiar, which is El Greco's Burial of the Count of Orgaz, in which the little boy, who may have been modeled on Jorge Manuel, who is El Greco's son, directs your attention to the saintly apparition that comes down to bury the very noble Count of Orgaz. But why would he have chosen children? Well, much like animals, children don't tell lies, right? Children will tell it like it is. The unvarnished truth comes directly from the mouths of babes, as I'm sure we've all experienced before. And we see animals in paintings doing the same thing. We looked at this work by Velázquez last week, and we saw that the brothers are trying to deceive their father. This is the story of Joseph's tunic. They come and show their father the bloodied tunic of their brother and say that he was devoured by wild beasts. And the father, in grief, absolutely believes them. But the trick that the audience sees that the father does not is that this little dog doesn't buy a single word of it. He can sniff out the truth. And that is why the figure of the child in these group compositions is particularly appropriate to coaching our responses and telling it like it is. We see genre-type figures already in his religious works peppered throughout his career. I'm sorry that this slide is so fuzzy, but I think we saw a little bit better, more clearly last week. the little boy, these boys are being dewormed by Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, and this was, of course, one of the altarpieces for the Caridad, and he's engaging in such a physical way with the viewer. He's looking straight at you, and he's showing you what it feels like. It's a multisensory approach to charity here. And we see it even in his earliest works. This is that first series that he won in 1645 for San Francisco el Grande, and you see the little children and even beggars included, and very carefully observed. So where does that leave us? What is genre painting? Are most of you familiar with genre painting? You know what it is? The most famous of Murillo's genre scenes is right on our doorstep, and it is absolutely the most famous, but also the most frustratingly enigmatic. So many different authors and scholars have tried to unlock what's going on here, and we're going to make an attempt towards the end of the lecture, but I just want you to keep this in mind. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about Murillo's genre painting. So genre painting is a genre of painting, which is not terribly helpful, but it is, and I put this slide here, I guess out of order, but this is one of Velázquez's most famous lifetime patrons, and he's a Flemish merchant living in Seville, and he is one of the principal collectors of, I'm sorry, I said Velázquez, I meant Murillo, Murillo's lifetime collectors, and he amassed a collection of over 30 works, including many genre scenes. And he would have had a particular taste for this because, as we will see, genre painting is very popular in Dutch and Flemish painting. And I think these two examples from the Met show you the range of subjects that genre painting treats. It's anything from the quiet comfort of domesticity to the raucous tavern scenes, where you've got these completely debauched smokers looking straight at you. So by the 1650s, the hierarchy of genres was completely solidified, and this was helped by the foundation of artistic academies across Europe, particularly in France. The Royal Academy, I think, is founded in 1648, and they dictate what kind of painting is worthwhile and what is less worthwhile. And of course, history painting, including narrative scenes from the Bible, from mythology, or from actual secular history, is of course the top. Why? Well, you can imagine history painting requires a very sophisticated approach to execution. For arranging a composition to tell a narrative is much more difficult in the eyes of the 17th century than perhaps just painting one figure in a portrait. You have to have a very sophisticated knowledge of history and literature, the classics, the Bible, in order to paint history painting. So it's a very intellectual exercise. Portrait painting is seen as on the next rung, and then on my computer, this little box went over genre painting. But as you can see, the technical gods are not with us today. But genre painting was down next on the rung, and only below it were landscape, animal painting, and still life. And indeed, all of those elements of landscape, animal painting, and still life are wrapped up with genre scenes, as we'll see. But in Spain in particular, genre painting was considered lowly by some, and Carducho, who is one of the big top two theorists of art in Spain in the 17th century, tells us why he finds it so distasteful. So, and here he's talking about genre painting. Of this abuse, and I've included the original for those of you who'd rather read the Spanish. Of this abuse, certain artists are in no small part guilty that have known so little or held so little regard, dragging down generous art to humble concepts, as can be seen today, of so many genre paintings with such low and vile thoughts, others of drunks, others of cheats, card sharps, and similar things, with no more ingenuity or argument than the painter having fancied portraying 4 disheveled rogues and 2 tartish women, to the reduction of art itself and the little reputation of the artist. So merely copying the surrounding world is one of the top critiques of genre painting. The crass and low subject matter is not too appreciated either, and even perhaps the glorification of reprehensible behavior, like being drunk in the street or soliciting a prostitute. All of these things are subjects that genre painting treats, and the lack of moral content is particularly disgusts Carduccio. However, other artists and artistic theorists like Pacheco defend genre painting, because we know from Pliny that painters in antiquity did also produce genre scenes. So where do Murillo's genre scenes come from? Are any of you familiar with Velázquez's genre scenes? Yes, so this, if any of you have ever had the chance to go to Apsley House in London, this is a showstopper. Now, remember, Velázquez was born in 1599, so he's 20 years old when he's doing this. And Velázquez does a number of what are called bodegones, which is the Spanish word for genre scenes. And his approach is to use them as an excuse to show off, and you'll see what I mean. He chooses to include all sorts of different textures and materials, and he's telling us, look, I can paint a clear glass, I can paint drops of water dripping down a ceramic jug, I can paint young skin and weathered older skin, I can paint anything. And he was not wrong. And we see that too. I believe this painting visited the Kimball a few years ago. Didn't the National Gallery of Scotland send a traveling exhibition? Yes, so many of you might have gotten a chance to see this in person, even if you didn't make it all the way to Scotland. But again, he's just absolutely, well, blank slide. He's absolutely showing off. He's got, you can almost hear the crackling of those huevos, fritos, going in that crock here. This perfectly executed egg. He's got the knife here, casting its shadow. And he's showing us, look, I mean, this kind of crepey skin of the older woman is perfectly described. And it's contrasted so nicely with the luminous skin of the youth. And we see Murillo certainly would have known Velázquez's genre scenes. Indeed, there's an inventory from his son at his death that says that they owned one Velázquez bodegon. We don't know which painting, nor if it survives, but it's possible that he owned one of Velázquez's genre scenes, or at least one in the style of Velázquez. So Murillo is painting these kinds of things throughout his entire career. And he's interested in naturalism, just like Velázquez, right? A convincing representation of the real world, like we see in The Old Woman Frying Eggs. But whereas Velázquez, even though these images are clearly very staged, they aren't in any way idealized. Murillo, on the other hand, is showing us more of an idealized vision of the real world. There's a tension between naturalism and idealization at play in almost all of his bodegones. And this is his earliest known genre scene from the Louvre, and you see this little boy who is very hungry. He's got nothing but shrimp shells scattered at his feet, and what is he doing? Well, he was originally the title was identified as a young beggar, but he's actually not a beggar at all. And you'll see this in a lot of Murillo genre scenes. They carry around little baskets. And this was a typical gig for a young, poor kid in 17th century Seville, was to be kind of an errand boy. They would run around town with baskets. And as the city kept growing and growing, you can imagine there were not as many markets in the suburbs. So what do? You send a little boy and you give him a couple coins, and he goes and does your errands for you. So most of Murillo's beggars are not beggars at all. They are working young children. But he is picking fleas from himself, which is quite a pitiable thing to do. And again, we see Murillo as that master of empathy in engaging the emotions of the viewer. And there are no adults at all in sight, and there's no swagger here. Sometimes when we think of the picaros, the genre of the picaresque, we think of them as kind of having this bravado. There's nothing like that here, just raw humanity. And it's a very sensitive and sympathetic approach. And this is what made it so mercilessly copied in the 19th century. And we'll see more about that in the fourth lecture. But this is one of his most copied works, and indeed one of the most copied works in the Louvre. We know that Manet actually copied this work, even though he didn't like Murillo in general. And we see Murillo being influenced, for example, by Dutch genre scenes. And this is a very similar scene here with a little boy ridding his dog of fleas. But whereas this little boy has the company of his dog, and we do see other scenes of older women picking fleas from little boys, this poor little boy is all alone. But in any case, he still maintains a decorous approach. You can see, I hope you can see what I mean by decorous. There's something glorifying about, even though his condition is so pitiable, there's something almost noble in his portrayal of this little boy. And unlike the Dutch, who painted most of their genre scenes very small canvases, when you see comparisons with the Dutch, I want you to look at the size of the canvas. This is only about, most of them are a foot in either direction or under, whereas Murillo is painting these over a meter. So these are very grand scale. He's painting the lowest imaginable subject with the highest imaginable skill. And we see artists like Caravaggio doing the same thing. And this is another painting from the Kimball that I'm sure you all know. And Caravaggio approaches these low subjects on a grand scale. And so much has been said about the link between Murillo's genre scenes and the genre of the picaresque, which is, as some of you might be aware, this very popular genre in the late 16th and throughout the 17th century in Spanish literature. Typically, they're first-person autobiographical narratives where a young person, particularly we see in the Lazarillo, goes from master to master, learning all of the things he needs to know to be completely vice-ridden and generally learning how to steal and thieve and cheat his way through life. And this relates to Spanish notions of inheritance that we see throughout the structure of Spanish society, right? The same thing when we see people being accused of judaizantes, right? People being accused of returning to the faith of their ancestors. Essentially, the 17th century Spanish view was that you were doomed to be whatever your blood set you up to be. And if that was, if you were born to a scullery maid and a passing thief, well, then that was all you would ever be capable of being. There's no such thing as the American dream in 17th century Seville. But unlike the picaresque, I think we can see things in common between picaresque literature and Murillo's paintings. But the approach is actually, if you think about it carefully, the approach is quite different. Whereas the picaresque works highlight the inherent ignobility of poverty, full of misdeeds, cheating, stealing. This is not really Murillo's approach. His gamers, when we see children gaming, they don't cheat. Most of his urchins, as I said, appear to be employed. Here I have an example of these two works from Russia. Both of these children are somewhat respectable, you might say, even though they're clearly from the street. And they're even quite charming. You can see the little boy, you can almost hear him pushing away the dog. For any of you who've ever spent any time around a dog, we've all done that, right? Telling the dog, no, you can't follow me, or you can't have what's in my basket. And we can contrast this with other depictions of the poor from the 17th century, such as these etchings from a French artist. And you can see there's nothing noble there. There's nothing exalted there. Nothing like we see in Murillo. And even in Rivera, who's a little club-footed boy here, he's carrying this little note that's asking explicitly for alms. So whereas Rivera's children are begging, you almost never see that in Murillo. The overlap, though, that can be most clearly appreciated between the picaresque, and this is something that has been pointed out in the scholarship, between the picaresque and Murillo's paintings, is the obsession with food. If any of you have ever read the Lazarillo, you remember that his driving force is his next meal. And he's a growing boy who has very little access to food, so you can imagine what that would mean. And you see the same obsession over and over again with food in Murillo's work. And we'll recall again that after the plague in 1649, there were years of famine. So hunger was something that was very much on the mind of 17th century civilians. But it's actually quite charming in this instance. You see these little boys eating melons and grapes. Just as we saw in his paintings of holy children, he seems to capture the spontaneity of expression and the frankness that only children have, even though the scenes are clearly posed. And we know that Murillo is an artist who sketches out his compositions and plans them all very carefully ahead of time. Even though they're clearly posed, there's nothing forced about this painting. And it doesn't feel dishonest. But a lot of his works have been traced to various folk sayings that circulated in Spain, including this one, en manos de un muchacho pronto el racimo es escobajo, right? In the hands of a young boy, quickly a bunch of grapes turns into an empty stalk. And any of us who've been around young boys can attest that that is probably true. We also know that a very good copy of this work, almost identical, entered an English aristocratic collection by 1658. So within just a few years of this original being painted, already it's been copied and has hit the international market. So if you'll recall, last time I mentioned that Murillo was the only artist, only Spanish artist with the exception of Rivera from this period to achieve a truly international reputation. And we already see within a few years of his works being painted, they're being voraciously consumed across the Pyrenees. If earlier we saw Murillo choosing to portray children because of their honesty, then why poor children in particular? Of course, we can look to the influence of the times. Like I've mentioned time and again, Seville was in a time of crisis in this period. And we will recall, again, as I already mentioned, that Murillo had joined the Brotherhood of the Caridad and completed a cycle of paintings for their church celebrating acts of charity. And we see in these works, he approaches charity in a serene and lyrical way. And we can think about this in terms of sermons at the time, that it was a common belief that we see documented, again, in sermons over and over, that the poor existed for the salvation of the rich, which today would be quite a bold and perhaps very distasteful thing to say, but this was something that was truly believed, that the poor existed for holy suffering and that to give the rich an opportunity for charity. So Murillo is, I just want to make it clear that Murillo's genre scenes are not social realism. They are an absolutely idealized vision of poverty and painted with an agenda. There is sympathy and poignancy, but there is an agenda. And I want to just point out a small episode to give you an idea of what society was like in the 17th century in Seville. After the famine, there were bread riots in 1652. A group of hungry, poor citizens of Seville broke into an armory, stole weapons, and went through the streets searching for grain. And this was quickly quashed by the civilian nobility. And the leaders of the riot were executed publicly, and their heads were placed on spikes. So civilian society, despite the idealized vision of rich and poor offered by Murillo, where the rich are very benevolent and kind and giving to the poor, the reality is that Seville was a place of fragile social structure, divided among tense class lines, and had quite a great deal of class antagonism. And the difficult conditions of famine, inflation, and plague only made the differences between rich and poor more painful. And we know that Murillo was aware of, and again, here's the idealized vision of rich and poor, right? The rich taking the clothes off their back, and the grateful poor accepting them. And that is what Murillo wants us to see in terms of 17th century civilian society. We know he was aware of the delicate balance that he had to strike in these pictures, because in some of the pictures that have been studied technically, we know that he made changes to the compositions. And this is one of the most important ones. It's an image in the Dulwich Picture Gallery. Again, we can see the British were very big fans of Murillo's Jean Racines and collected them avidly. And originally, well, I guess we should talk about what's going on here, right? A group of two young kind of street urchin boys, neither of them have shoes, their clothes are in tatters, have a little pie here, again, the prominence of food in Murillo's scenes, and a black serving boy. We know he's a serving boy because he's probably on an errand carrying a jug here, and he comes and he's trying to get his hands on that pie. Originally, this figure, who here seems to just kind of like laugh at what's going on, originally his face, we know, was in more of a sneer, and his hand was slapping away the hand of the little black boy. And we can see that Murillo decided that that might have gone too far, and it wasn't in line with the more idealized version of childhood and poverty that he wanted to portray in his work. And it's interesting to note that this may in fact portray two of Murillo's sons and the son of his house slave, who is named Juana de Santiago. But in any case, Murillo takes the opportunity to show off his mastery of fluid brushwork that we've seen over and over again. And the dirty fingernails I just love. And then, of course, the dirty feet. Again, Murillo as the master of dirty feet, which is probably all that you're going to take away from the lecture today. But that's all right. The same meditation here on the meanness of poverty, right? Where poverty forces you to be, to not be charitable, right? Because we see the little boys doing the exact opposite of charity. Here they're guarding their food and refusing to share. We see the same theme repeated in this pair of paintings, and this is the only instance that we know of Murillo making two copies of the same work. His works were, of course, copied, but both of these are given to Murillo in his catalog. And this is kind of a funny scene, but also quite sinister in a way. This old woman is eating migas. She's eating her humble meal of breadcrumbs. And she thinks that he's there to take them, so she pulls away. She's not going to share her meal. And we see this dog, he's just waiting for the right opportunity to get in on the action. And then this boy is almost sneering at us. He's almost functioning in terms of the festaiuolo that we talked about earlier. But there's something, rather than coaching our response, he almost makes us feel very uncomfortable. And I'm not sure if you get that same sense from this painting, but I find there's something latently sinister at play here. It's not quite the idealized vision of poverty that we saw, for example, in the painting of the little saint distributing his clothes. This was another painting that circulated, and we know that one of the copies, this one here, that's now in England, was already in England by the 1690s. Another internal narrative and moralizing note drives this work also at Dulwich, in which a little boy who's on an errand, most likely, he's carrying the jug, and he's enjoying his meal of bread. He is invited to play argolla, which is like a croquet type game, but with a paddle, and you can see the balls for the game down there on the floor. He's invited to join in on the game, and you can see the this is the tempter, you can see the moral quandary going on in the head of the other little boy as he's deciding, do I stop when I'm supposed to be working and play the game, or do I keep going? And I do think we can see this participating in the tension between ocio and negocio, or odium and negodium, which is brought up a lot in Cervantes, but it's the idea of like leisure versus work. And thus the painting can be read to have moralizing overtones. And I think it's quite interesting, Murillo's approach to the psychology of these individual children. You can see the wheels turning in his head as he's deciding what to do. And charming elements. Again, Murillo is one of the best painters of dogs as well as children. Hungry dogs. Almost all of his dogs are ready to steal your meal the second you look away. And he's looking at the boy, and he takes the opportunity, just like Velázquez did, to finally observe still life elements. And here that's represented in the game, the elements of the game. These images of beggar boys and their dirty feet became what was quintessential of Murillo in the 19th century, to the point that they were even turned into wallpaper. And the wallpaper, examples of these wallpaper that was mass-produced and marketed to the middle class in the 19th century. This is pure Victoriana, right? And examples still survive in the V&A in London. But can you imagine like wallpapering your bathroom with Murillo's beggar boys? And I'm curious to learn how exactly that fit in terms of scale and how you would arrange the wallpaper. But that is something to ask a 19th century interior specialist and not a 17th century Spanish painting specialist. But again, we see the influence of northern artists in his genre scenes, and yet a completely distinct approach. Again, notice the difference in size here and here. This is a very large work, and this is very small. And this artist, Peter van Leer, was a member of the circle called the Bamboccianti, which were Dutch and Flemish painters working in Rome at mid-17th century. And here you see another game of chance, but rather than playing the game like they do in Murillo's work, in the Dutch work, the little boys are only observers. So again, we see that unique protagonism of children that is a key theme throughout Murillo's work. He also painted allegorical genre scenes, which for some reason, technical difficulties are really rampant today, but there are more slides, so yes, okay. Her and then him. Imagine them together. So we're going to talk about this pair. Such as a spring and summer. Here we know that both of these were owned by Justino de Neve, who is the patron, the canon of Seville Cathedral, and the patron behind the renovation of Santa Maria la Blanca. We saw that in the first slide today, and then last week. And then after his death, that gentleman whose portrait I showed you, the Flemish merchant working in Seville, he bought them from Justino's estate. But the charm of this girl was famous beyond Murillo's lifetime. In the 18th century, it was in the collection of a French countess, and she was thought to be kind of like a Moorish girl, exotic or maybe Turkish in some way. And in fact, there is something international about this, but it's likely not what they thought in the 18th century. But there has been an argument that this shawl that she's wearing is in fact of Mexican design, which would have been perfectly in keeping with the type of things Murillo was exposed to in Seville, since it was the epicenter of the trade in the Americas. But both paintings He's taking the opportunity to show off his confidence and skill. You can see he loads the brush, and then he knows precisely how to sweep it to make these textures. When you get up close to any painterly painting, everything dissolves. But then when you go from afar, they perfectly come into focus. And that is the beauty and the drama and the magic of the painterly style. Like all of Murillo's, pretty much all of Murillo's scenes of young girls, young street girls, there are arguments that she is selling more than flowers. But I'm not sure that in this particular case, although we will see some more convincing cases as we go on, I'm not sure that that's the case here. I think that it's just an allegory. But I would be curious to hear your thoughts on that. The pendant is this allegory of summer. And we can see, again, he's absolutely showing off. Because it's a male figure, he can show off his approach to the nude, right? The human form with the musculature that he is so carefully portraying in this allegory of summer. Also, we get a sense of his approach to movement. The face, you almost feel like he's moving his head, and we've been caught in kind of a mid-moment. There's sketchiness around the edges that suggests movement. And still, he's chosen to focus on still life elements, but also you can see him really just showing off, I think. You can imagine the very tiny brush he would have had to use to get these sheaves of wheat to look just perfectly. And when we look at the larger view, and I apologize for this slide. It's a little fuzzy, but you can see he's really quite accomplished here. Let's see. So under the surface of several of Murillo's genre scenes, some scholars have noted an erotic implication, as I mentioned. And these are more convincing in the following pictures that I hope will help us understand the most enigmatic genre scene of all, the Kimball Murillo. And we'll start with this pair from London. This boy by himself seems innocent enough, but when he's paired with the pendant of the girl lifting her veil, you might see that his what was first a gentle smile becomes an ambiguous leer. You see the clothes falling off the shoulder of this girl. In 17th century civilian society, that is not something that a respectable young woman would be portrayed doing, nor lifting her veil, which we know from the period was considered to be a sign of availability. And we see the same thing at work from this image at the National Gallery, which if you don't know much about 17th century Seville, it just seems quite innocuous and charming. And it is charming, but I'm not so sure that it's innocuous. There's a potential sexual reading in the frank gaze of the girls. Of course, he's borrowing from a very common Dutch trope of portraying women at a window. But in Spain, there were all sorts of phrases that would suggest women at a window are not respectable, like la mujer ventanera, uva de la calle. So a woman who can be seen at a window is like ripe for the picking. She's a grape on the street. And we know within 50 years of this being painted, it was reproduced in print and given a title of Las Gallegas, and meaning no offense to Galicians, because they're lovely people, but in this period, Galician women were considered to be of loose morals, and this is a phrase, moza gallega sin seguirla se entrega, right? You don't have to pursue a Galician woman. She's, again, ripe for the picking. We know, too, that Goya agreed with this reading of the painting because he knew the owner during his lifetime, and he was able to see it, and he reinterprets the same scene for his painting of a Maja and the Celestina on a balcony. And we know, for those of you who are familiar with Spanish literature, we know that the Celestina, she is the most famous procuress, perhaps in the Western literary canon, right? And she's typically portrayed as an old crone, often with a shawl over her head, and sometimes with glasses, which might remind you of somebody. But in any case, Regardless of whether they are loose women or even prostitutes, they are charmingly portrayed, and the psychology of the subjects permits a very intimate engagement on the part of the viewer. We are projected directly into their space, and they directly address us. And if they are indeed prostitutes, we as viewers, or more specifically his original viewers of the upper crust civilian men, are implicated by their flirtation. So we've been roped in to what's going on here. Similarly dated and much more difficult to interpret is the Four Figures on the Step from the Kimball. It is a spectacular painting, but its dynamic is very unusual, and it's very difficult to piece together what's going on. It's a painting that actually resists being interpreted, and there are so many different perspectives on what's going on here. And just because it resists being interpreted, that doesn't mean it'll stop us from trying. But I think it could be easy first to talk about what we're seeing here. You might call it an unholy family. You have a flashily dressed young man with a cocky, mocking smile. A not particularly attractive young woman pulls back at his shoulder here and lifts her veil, which we already saw what that means, and her very unflattering expression of puzzlement on her face. And then we see an old woman with glasses who rests her hands protectively on the head of a young boy. And we see that the young boy's bottom has been exposed, which is quite strange. And the whole composition seems to direct you towards that. It's right at center. When it's hung at eye height, you can't miss it. And the hand of this figure makes the composition flow directly towards that exposed rear. So you really can't avoid talking about it. But what it means is a whole nother enigma that really I don't think has been convincingly solved. Each of these figures on their own are understandable. It's the combination that's so frustrating. We see this is a series of the prodigal son. In this one, he's being chased out by harlots. And we see almost all of the same cast of characters here, with the exception of the little boy. There's an older woman who's probably the madam. There's a gallantly dressed young man. He might be on offer or he might be a client. And then this isn't exactly what we would think prostitutes would be dressed like today, but this is how they were dressed in the 17th century. So you could see parallels in his other works, like this one from the Avelló collection, the same mocking smile. And then I've included an image of the Celestina here, the procuress, and you can see how she's often portrayed with those glasses. But then we're thrown off by the little boy. Why is he a little picaro, but why has his backside been exposed? Well, we know that what's frustrating from a viewer's perspective is that he's engaging with these tropes that are about happy domesticity of older women picking lice from the heads of little boys. There's something very tender going on there. And indeed, her hands are very protective. And this is something that he is interpreting from Dutch genre scenes, but Jonathan Brown has pointed out a relationship to another painting, and again, this slide is terrible, so you're going to have to squint. But this is a scene, this is the procuress, this is the prostitute, and then you can see this figure with the hat here, there's the hat, there's the face. I know it's very hard to see, but he is the client, and look, he's grabbing onto the girl, and the procuress has a little boy in her lap that he is delousing. So that really does complicate our understanding of the picture. And where does this leave us? Well, I'm not sure, but I do think that we can look at this painting as perhaps a meditation on viewing, particularly given the prominent glasses that the old woman is wearing, which certainly fit with the scene about vision and viewing. And again, like with the women in the window, the viewer is implicated. We're brought into the scene. There's no contextualizing information. There's nothing in the background. They're just on the ledge right in our space. And we are made painfully aware of our position as a voyeur because the little boy, all of them are looking at us and reacting to our reaction, but the little boy can't see us, and we're looking at his exposed bottom, which is not a very comfortable place to be. And I think that this painting might be best understood in light of, there's an art historian, a very famous art historian called Michael Fried, who has a model for understanding painting in a much later period, but he calls it absorption and theatricality. An absorptive painting is one in which the painted are not at all aware of being viewed, whereas a theatrical one shows figures who are completely aware of the fact that they are being viewed, and thus it becomes theatrical. In any case, the painting draws the viewer in only to antagonize him, and it's one of Murillo's most iconic and yet enigmatic works with no satisfactory reading to date. So I encourage all of you to give it a shot. And I'm happy to give you bibliographic references if you want to read more about this painting. And yes, Jonathan Brown has a very unsavory reading of The Reason the Little Boy's Breeches Are Open, but I completely disagree. I don't think that is at all in line with Murillo's other portrayals of children. But finally, I just want to close with one of the elements that makes these paintings feel so uncomfortable that you may not have realized what it was that was making you uncomfortable, but it's the smile. And that is because smiles are so rare in painting before, I would say, 1780, that every time they're included, they're almost there to make you very uncomfortable. And that's for good reason. Any teeth-bearing smiles are almost always on the faces of drunks, or very uncomfortable figures. This is Caravaggio's famously scandalous figure of Cupid, and what was most famous was not the whole corporeal situation, but his open-mouthed smile. And again, we see this in Dutch works. In this stock figure of the drunkard, you can see his rosy cheeks. He's clearly finished that tankard, and he's smiling as a result. Also, this prostitute, she's smiling at us and pointing at a lewd image. So smiles are not something that respectable people do. And upstairs, the only smile that I could think of in the Meadows collection from the early modern period, or modern period, I suppose, with Goya, is on the face of a lunatic. So you don't see many happy smiles. And indeed, it was considered very impolite in polite society to smile. And I brought in a quote from France from about 1700. There are some people who raise their upper lips so high that their teeth are almost entirely visible. Can you imagine? This is entirely contradictory to decorum, which forbids you to allow your teeth to be uncovered, since nature gave us lips to conceal them. And one might attribute this hesitation to smile in some ways to, you might imagine, dental technology in the pre-modern period was not so great. And indeed, when we see a revolution in dental care about 1680 in France, we see artists beginning to smile, including respectable ones like Vigée Lebrun. And many of her self-portraits that were exhibited at the Salon were most scandalous because of the smile. She was a very respectable upper-class woman, and it was unimaginable that she would be portrayed with a smile. Finally, I just want to quickly go through influence. The most direct heir in Seville of Murillo, Jean Racines, is an artist called Villavicencio, and he does approach some of the same subjects, but not with the same sprezzatura, charm, grace, ease, lyricism that we see in Murillo. His works circulated widely, both in painted copies but also in prints, to the point that some of the works in his catalog have been attributed and de-attributed over the years, such as this work in London. It's still given to Murillo in the catalog, but the National Gallery no longer gives it to Murillo. It's considered a very close copy, perhaps of a lost original. And even artists like Manet we see influenced by Murillo's Jean Racines. And if you want to learn more, I haven't brought a handout today like last week, but I highly encourage you to take a look at the catalog from the exhibition in Dulwich, at the Dulwich Picture Gallery in 2001, especially the essays by Peter Cherry. So thank you, and I'd like to invite you to ask any questions. Yes. Yes. He does. And it does. And the shoes, if you'll notice, there's an interesting reading of this by two literary scholars. The shoes are clean and new. If you notice, most of Murillo's beggar boys do not have shoes on at all. And now you might, I might lose you when I point this out, but that, for some, fits more in line with Jonathan Brown's reading. There's an episode in the Lazarillo in the 4th chapter, I think, where the priest gives Lazarillo new shoes, and then he leaves the priest. And some literary scholars have interpreted that as a nefarious situation going on between the priest and the young boy. And the new shoes are the symbolic of that. So again, I might have lost you on that, but that's not my argument. It's I'll blame Professor Seberg from Hopkins, who is the picaresque expert. But yes, the shoes here, there is something going on with the shoes. I'm just not. Yes. Sorry. Okay. You want the shoes? Yes. Yes. Any other questions? Yes. Well, I feel as though you might categorize costumbrismo as a type of genre painting, particularly focused on different, like, regional differences. I don't think that there is anything typically regional about Murillo's works. And as a matter of fact, most of his works are entirely divorced from the context of Seville. All of the children, you might have noticed, are in almost classical ruin type spaces, or as in this case, in no context at all. And you see costumbrismo coming a lot in the next century. So, but this anticipates that, certainly. And we do have some fine examples of costumbrismo here at the Meadows, which would be fun to explore. Uh-huh. Which is all about the voice. Yes, well, that's true. I've heard an argument relating this figure of this boy, since he's so well dressed, but among these lowlives, with, I don't know if you've ever read El Celoso Extremeño, which is one of his novelas ejemplares, Cervantes, in which an old man has a very beautiful young wife, and a guy fitting this precise description seduces the young wife. So we can see, and I did bring a passage from Quevedo about gracias y desgracias del ojo del culo, which is a little rude. So I didn't decide, I abandoned my bravery at the end and decided not to bring that in. But in it, he does compare the rear to a face. So you could even think about this as a fourth face, if this is a meditation on viewing. Now, again, I may have lost you there with that one, too. But
I'm just curious, because there's always this comparison made in the talk made of the Dutch paintings, and we know there was so much trade going on in Seville, but
yes.
Anybody documented what Dutch paintings were there? Do we really know what they might have seen?
We don't know which exact paintings, but they are listed in inventories of some of these collectors, like the Flemish merchant that we saw earlier. But the descriptions are all pretty sparse in inventories, yes. And we know, for example, remember last week when we talked about the renovation of Santa Maria la Blanca, and we talked about the paintings, the outdoor paintings exhibition, including the Jacob from upstairs was hung outside? Well, Dutch paintings were hung outside as part of that. So Dutch and Flemish works would have been something that civilians would have been exposed to.
Even though they're tiny?
Even though they're tiny, yes. Well, they weren't on the palace facade. But yes, even though they're tiny. Yeah, it is interesting. And of course they would know these from prints as well. Any other questions? Or y'all are free. Next week we'll talk about the Immaculate Conception and San Fernando. And we might have a projector by then, huh?